Greetings and welcome to our first in a series of webinars which are replacing our face-to-face member workshops as we adapt to our virtual workspaces and keep ourselves and each other safe and healthy. My name is Cherise Gals and I'm going to take you through some housekeeping rules. You're automatically muted with cameras off, so we can only presume that you're not in your PJs. And so it would be great if you greet each other using the chat function. That's fine. Questions should go to Q&A as Trevor and Shane have asked you. Thank you for taking the time to spend the next hour with us. And now on to what you can expect to hear from our speakers. So first on the agenda today, I'd like to paint a picture of where we find ourselves right now and some of the drivers behind the changing landscape that we're experiencing. We will then hear from David Drew, who is the Head of Sustainability for the Southeast Africa Business Unit at the Coca-Cola Company. David will talk about why recycling value chains typically need assistance, why EPR is such an effective means of stimulating and sustaining the recycling value chain, and how the approach and quantum of support may need to change over time. We will then have a panel discussion with Q&A from yourselves. And if you've sent your questions through, we'll actually try our best to get to all of them. But if not, you know where to find us afterwards too. As always, we trust that you'll find your time with us this morning both interesting and informative. Speaking of agendas, there are many competing and varied agendas facing all of us today. The face of society has changed considerably. In the EU and Japan, for example, society is much older, while in South Africa, younger. Nearly 1/3 of our population is between the ages of 18 and 34. There are many single households. Convenience and on-the-go food has increased along with increased urbanization. The discussion used to be all about food waste and the role of packaging in prevention of food waste. Now, the talk is dominated by coronavirus and climate change, and the major think tanks in the world, such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, are driving the change from a linear to a circular economy. Globally, and particularly in Africa and Asia, communities are facing unprecedented challenges in managing waste, including paper and packaging materials. Legislation is evolving and changing. The global flow of materials has altered. Taxes and bans are discussed when other options aren't clear. Brand owners are committing to targets for recycled content collection and recycling. Numerous associations and organizations with varying degrees of knowledge and experience are becoming much more involved in the conversations. But one thing that is certain is that unlocking the opportunities in the secondary raw material value chains within the waste sector will be a key driver of the circular economy in South Africa. China's refusal to become the West's dumping ground is forcing the world to face up to a recycling crisis that has laid bare the uncomfortable economics behind household recycling. Many countries are realizing that they do not, in fact, have the infrastructure to deal with all recyclables. The coronavirus pandemic has brought economic activity to a virtual standstill, impacting consumption, logistics and supply chains, productivity, unemployment, and a whole range of products, including hand sanitizers and masks of all descriptions, are newly on the market. Who would have thought Venice would be this empty in the year 2020? The full effect of COVID on our world will be felt for a long time into the future. At Petco specifically, we estimate consumption of PET to be down 18% on our original forecast for this year. While this means less bottles onto the market, it means less income for Petco, and the demand for some of our traditional end-use products, like fiber, has contracted substantially. Fortunately, we have been producing food-grade rPET since 2009, and there is healthy demand for this. Waste management in South Africa is in a crisis. There are new minimum requirements coming into effect for the management of landfill sites, whilst in many areas of our country over the past 20 years, the existing requirements have not yet been met. Engineered and sanitary landfill sites require competent and disciplined landfill management teams. Currently, the true costs of landfilling are not recovered. The pricing structure is far too low. If this becomes more realistic, what will happen in the illegal dumping space? Our population is approximately 57 million, and 54 million tons of general waste and 66 million tons of hazardous waste are produced per annum, 90% of which is landfilled. So we are fast running out of airspace in our country. Future landfills will be regional and macro landfills. Compliance will force increased disposal fees and operating standards. Municipalities can no longer afford to offer free disposal. Future landfill managers will have a challenging time and will require significant skills. Both waste generation and waste disposal have increased significantly. And new sites are needed because the current ones are filling up way too fast. It's a long, complex, and contested process to get a new landfill site licensed, particularly a large one capable of serving a municipal area in a metropolitan region. In the case of Cape Town, the process to establish a new regional landfill site has taken 17 years, and the process is not yet complete. This slide was shared with us by Leon Krobler of the Institute of Waste Management, and here you can actually see a sanitary landfill site at the top, and you can actually see alongside it effectively a dump site where sorting is taking place. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity to manage. South Africa is a signatory to international climate agreements with targets and responsibilities. Cleaner production and consumption is part of the change required. We also face an energy crisis, even though up until this week, load shedding seemed like a distant word. The price of oil has plummeted with challenging consequences for the plastic sector in particular. Global carbon emissions have dropped due to the pandemic, but this is only temporarily. Competition for resources, the demand for housing, for shelter, for food and energy, leaves waste not being viewed as a priority. It's falling outside the established waste management systems at unprecedented levels. And when we eventually get it into the system, it's still a mess, resulting in an unacceptable level of pollution. Many informal settlements butt onto streams and canals and become a feeder into the river network and stormwater network, and ultimately land up in the ocean. Often the design of paper and packaging products is done in isolation with no clear understanding of the recycling infrastructure on the ground and how it actually technically works. Why are multi-layers problematic? Why do colors lower the value of recyclate, ultimately impacting on the economic feasibility of the full value chain? Different definitions and standards of measurement abound. There's an input measurement where you measure the collection of material for recycling. There's an output measurement where you actually measure what product has been recycled and processed and what can now be sold downstream back into the economy. There's pre and post consumer material. There are byproducts and losses. How do we account for imports and exports? How do we count packaged imported goods? So how are we to get a full understanding of the flow of paper and packaging materials if there's no consistency of measurement for us to have an accurate benchmark and tracking system? It's really important for us to see where we are so that we know what we need to do to get where we want to be. Behavior change is a key component, and consistent, clear messaging is vital. Is a carrot approach enough? Do we need more of a stick approach? Do we need better enforcement? Do we need humor? Or is this simply desperation? Mummy still cleans up after me? I sometimes pause to wonder. The Polokwane Declaration on Waste Management, which occurred in September 2001, and it was adopted at the first National Waste Summit, and it set the goals of stabilizing waste generation, reducing waste disposal by 50% by 2012, and developing a plan for zero waste by 2022. I think we could all say that that was really good intent, perhaps naive, perhaps unrealistic. So I think it's time to reflect back before we go on our next journey and say, what are we trying to achieve? What do we need to achieve? We have a waste hierarchy, which shows us the most favored to the least favored options. We have a circular economy view, which is an economic system aimed at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources. We need to look for sustainability, for balance, avoiding the depletion of resources. And then, of course, job creation and economic activity, local beneficiation to improve the economic value of waste. This leads to the question, how are we going to do it? There are a range of tools at our disposal. The Product Stewardship Institute believes that EPR reflects the true costs of our actions and our purchases. Extended producer responsibility is all about shared responsibility. This infographic shows the role of the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, in a circular material flow. Luckily, there are some 380 EPR schemes globally that we can learn from, although I have to let you know that no two schemes are the same anywhere. As my colleague Joachim Corden of Expra says, EPR is a concept, but not a concrete business plan. So it allows for adaptation to specific local circumstances, but it also invites the introduction of beliefs, ideology, and experiments. Therefore, we need dialogue to exchange best practice and failure. It's very important that we unpack where we do experience failures so that we can learn from them, to define the needed levels of harmonization, to look for synergies, to benchmark and evaluate. On that note, I'm going to hand over to David to take you through the nuts and bolts.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. I'm sure you're all sick of Zoom meetings in your home, but I hope you've got enough wine for the next year, and I hope I can keep you interested for the next 20 minutes or so and try and give you some insight into EPR. As I'm not standing in front of you and I'm a little face on the corner of the screen, I thought it would be useful to share a bit about myself before we begin. As Sherry mentioned, I'm the head of sustainability at Coca-Cola in the region, and I'm also director of Petco, a director of Metpack SA, and the Glass Recycling Company. I grew up in Durban, as my wife reminds me is evident from my accent, and I was once formally trained as a chemical engineer. I then joined the real world and started working in the FMCG space at Unilever for 10 years, and then left to join what was at that time a relatively small packaging company called Boxmore. Boxmore grew up over the years and was eventually sold to the Alpla Group, one of the global packaging giants. And a little while later, I decided that having made a lot of plastic bottles in my 12 years, I better try and clean them up. So here I am at Coca-Cola. From the pictures, you can probably deduce that I have a wife and a son, and together we love to travel the world and particularly get out into the bush and see the nature. I used to be a runner, but then I got better. So now I spend a fair amount of time on my bicycle. And despite my time in the plastics industry, I've always had a passion for the environment. And I guess that's probably why I'm a director of Petco and why I have a passion for EPR. So let's get on to the subject at hand. Societies across the world share many of the same needs. but have developed vastly different solutions to these same challenges. These solutions develop not only in response to the need itself, but are heavily influenced by the context. The society, the geography, the economic environment all contribute significantly to the solutions that evolve. We often look for best practice or ideas that develop independently elsewhere and then adapt them where we can, but sometimes we accept that what works in one part of the world simply won't work in another. However, when it comes to waste management and recycling, I think we tend to be a bit more utopian in our approach. We see what happens in the developed world in particular and imagine that these solutions to recycling should be applied locally. Return vending machines, multicolored bins, curbside collection, and automated recycling plants that can ingeniously separate our waste into useful parts would be nice to have. However, in South Africa, our current reality, and in many other developing economies, looks more like this. Far less sophisticated, but not necessarily much less effective. It may seem hard to believe, but in many emerging countries have comparable or better collection and recycling rates than the USA, for example. Now, when it comes to bullet trains and some other amazing public infrastructure we might see in large international cities, we seem to accept that these fantastic solutions might be out of our price range, or be a solution for 2030 or 2050 in some city of the future. When it comes to recycling, however, we are far less patient. And rightly so. We shouldn't have to live in polluted cities with poor or non-existent waste management. The challenge is that like bullet trains, these kind of solutions are not free. And so governments everywhere are grappling with the challenge of providing the kinds of services that citizens want, but simply don't have the money to pay for. As you can imagine then, a concept that suggests that producers of products that become waste should pay for it to be collected and recycled starts to sound like a really good idea. And that's why extended producer responsibility is gaining traction globally. But what exactly is EPR? Although it has slightly different interpretations across the world, extended producer responsibility is a concept that links the producer of waste with the costs of cleaning up the waste. It's like insisting that dog walkers use a pooper scooper. If you have a dog and you want to walk that dog in the park, you need to clean up after your dog. In principle, therefore, it seeks to link the external or indirect costs or consequences of making something or using something with the cost of using that material. The more difficult it is to properly manage a material after use, the more cost should be attached to using that material in the form of an EPR fee. This is called eco-modulation, and it should, if correctly applied, encourage better material choices and product design. So if you're a producer of plastic packaging, you have a responsibility to ensure that the plastic can be properly managed after use. I say managed because it's not actually implicit that you should be recycling an EPR. But what is important is that you prevent the product having a negative impact on the environment. Recycling is therefore one of the potential solutions. It's now generally impractical for individuals or even companies to try and address these kinds of issues alone. So we form and contribute financially to producer responsibility organizations like Petco. And as a collective, we seek to address the need to properly manage the impact of the products we use after they have been used. So PROs, producer responsibility organizations like Petco, are the way in which we as industry will meet these obligations. These obligations generally have some common goals, like reducing the use of unnecessary materials and increasing collection and recycling. But in the South African context, we potentially have some other social aspects to extended producer responsibility. And other developing countries might have a similar vision for EPR. Now, understanding the obligations of PROs in an environment where we have both governmental, municipal, and private sector operating can be difficult. So I'm going to try and show you how I think it's easiest to understand EPR. I started off by talking about trains. So maybe a nice way to think about EPR and remember this discussion is to think about the mind the gap sign some of you may be familiar with on the London Underground. EPR is about closing the gap. What gap? Recycling is a business, isn't it? People make money from recycling. Well, I want you to think about recycling in the recycling value chain in two halves. On the left-hand side, you have the cost of collecting, sorting, cleaning, and processing the recyclables into a form that could be reused by the converter. And on the right-hand side, you have what the converter is willing to pay for that recycled material. It's a principle common to many commercial supply chains. The best comparison, however, is probably mining. We're familiar with mining, so let's take an example of gold. Gold is extracted from rock deep underground. The ore is crushed and treated to isolate the gold, and the gold is then refined and finally sold. Now, like mining, the challenge with recycling is that sometimes the cost to recover and process the recyclables exceeds the value that someone is willing to pay for it. Like mining, the end-use price can be influenced by market forces over which you have absolutely no control. Oil price, rand-dollar exchange rate, COVID-19. Now, in mining, when the gold price drops or the rand strengthens, we hear about mines closing shafts or shutting down. Critically, they aren't shutting down because there's no gold left. They stop operating because it doesn't make economic sense to continue. In recycling, the same applies. At times, it doesn't make economic sense to keep recycling, or it only makes sense to dig so deep, as it were. The difference is that we aren't okay with recyclables being left on our curbside or sent to landfill when this happens. And so EPR is about closing the economic gap to ensure that recycling continues even when it would otherwise not make economic sense. Now, the challenge with recycling is that this value chain must typically interact with a broader sphere of waste management. Waste management is generally a service provided by governments and municipalities, and so we forget or ignore the cost of providing these services. I think most of us can understand that providing the services for general waste cost money, but when it comes to recycling, we tend to jump to the conclusion that collecting recyclables is now a profitable enterprise. This is unfortunately seldom true. So if we want recycling to be universal, the challenge becomes, how do we pay for it? As I see it, there are typically four models that are most commonly employed to pay for it. And unfortunately, at the center of all of these options is the consumer. Governments can encourage recycling through policy, taxes, incentives, and in some cases may even operate the recycling systems themselves. Most commonly, however, municipalities integrate recycling into the broader waste management that they provide, and citizens essentially pay for this through their rates. They can also incentivize recycling through landfill fees or pay-as-you-throw systems. Container deposit systems can be applied for some products, and they essentially put the responsibility on the consumer. The consumer pays a deposit and only gets it back when they return the empty bottle. The consumer also essentially brings the bottle back to the shop at their cost. In contrast, an EPR system sees industry take the lead in both raising and deploying the funding to enable recycling, and governments and society in general then hold industry, or the producers as they are called, accountable for the results achieved. A successful system clearly needs alignment with state and municipal policy, but I believe that in most environments, EPR-based systems can not only achieve better results, but can do so at lower costs. Now, I know some of you are going to be challenging my earlier assertion that recycling needs assistance, so let me expand on this a little bit. The reality is that value chains for different materials and different environments have a huge impact on the need for EPR. Many recyclable materials will be recycled with little or no assistance at low levels. I call this organic recycling. For PET, this is typically in the range of 15 to 30%, depending on the socio-economic environment. Studies we've commissioned as Coke have actually demonstrated that sometimes these rates are inversely proportional to GDP. So in other words, the poorer a country, the higher the organic recycling level, which may explain why the US has such bad recycling. So yes, you don't always need to fund recycling. But then again, we're not going to be satisfied with 20 or 30% collection of PET. The challenge is that as we increase the recycling rate, the costs tend to escalate and the gap we spoke about starts to open. So in these slides, you'll see the orange bar. If I just go back, as we increase the recycling rate, we need to go further and the orange gap starts to grow. To increase the recycling rate, we have to pay the collector more or the waste company more. We have to travel further to pick up bottles from smaller towns outside major cities, so the logistics costs increase. And we have to accept colored bottles and dirtier bottles, increasing the processing losses. So critically, as we increase our ambitions about where we want to get to in terms of recycling, the need for EPR potentially becomes necessary and it grows. The reality is that value chains for different materials Now, as I said, the value chains are different for different materials in different places. PET has a relatively high processing cost, and by that I mean the energy and effort required to turn a discarded bottle into material that can be used to make a new one is quite high. Aluminium, on the other hand, has very little processing cost. Recycled aluminium cans can be thrown into a furnace at a rolling mill with very little processing. And this is one of the reasons why the street value of cans can be so much higher than the street value of PET bottles. Glass, on the other hand, also has a very low processing cost. But unlike aluminium, the value of the virgin material sets a very low benchmark. And this is one of the reasons why glass has a very low street value. So we have two major factors: the cost and complexity of recycling on one hand, and the value of the virgin alternative on the other. As I said earlier, it's about balancing the two halves of the equation. Now, if we look at the right-hand side, we can expand a bit more to understand what sets the value that converters already are willing to pay for the recycled material. The first and obvious factor, as I've just indicated, is the value or cost of the virgin alternative. This sets the base. The higher the value of the virgin material, potentially the higher the recycled material can be. The next question, however, is, are you prepared to pay more or less for recycled material? Brand owners are increasingly using recycled content as a differentiator, and in so doing are actually creating additional value for the recycled content. This is particularly prevalent in cases where demand for recycled content outstrips supply. In many cases now, the value of recycled PET exceeds the value of virgin PET. Paying a premium for recycled content increases the value and closes the EPR gap. But there are other factors. In glass, using cullet results in about a 30% energy saving versus using silica and soda ash. So this also helps create value. Using locally produced recyclate may also save on other things like import duties and transport costs. In other materials, there could be a cost to using recycled content, in energy, in material losses, in contamination, or in simply in the cost of additional equipment to handle it. Another factor is policy. In some countries, there are tax incentives which promote the use of recycled content or taxes for those that don't. Both of these can create value. Critically, where there is extra value in recycled content, the need for EPR reduces. But where users expect a discount for it, the need for support increases. This is another reason why focusing on recycling products back into higher value items is so important. It ultimately reduces the cost of EPR. And that's one of the reasons why Petco is so focused on growing the consumption of rPET. Once we understand and accept that the value chain needs support, it's then easier to understand how you can do this. There are many ways for PROs to influence and support the recycling value chain, and not all of them are direct financial intervention. PROs must play a critical role in influencing their members through things like improved product design and educating consumers and influencing their behavior. In terms of the measure that can more directly influence the sustainability of recycling value chain, it's probably easiest to think about 4 categories that I've highlighted here. Collection support is essentially supporting the cost of collection so that the material arrives at the recycler at a competitive cost. This could be done by supporting informal waste collectors or by paying a formal collector to collect more of your recyclables. It can even be the act of physically separating your recycling and taking it to the sorting station. Often collection support is provided directly via municipal services. Logistics support is often required when you try to grow recycling, and you have to find ways to offset the cost of collecting materials from faraway recyclers. Without this kind of intervention, recycling can be limited to a small geographic area. Support at the recycler is probably the most common form, and it's either in the form of pro rata support for input or output, or capital subsidies to encourage investment and therefore more recycling. Support at the recycler should reduce the cost and risk of them doing business in order that they can either grow or afford to pay more for the recycled materials that they need. Lastly, there's non-EPR support. And here the role of PROs is to influence policies that can increase or incentivize either recycling or the consumption of recycled content. So once you've figured out how you need to support the value chain and by how much, you need to raise the money. In an EPR model, the money is typically raised on the consumption of a material during production. Essentially, this means that you need to start considering the EPR cost as another supply chain cost or simply part of your raw material cost. I also highlighted that EPR costs and therefore EPR fees are not and should not be the same for all materials. We come back to the concept of eco-modulation. As such, EPR correctly applied, when EPR is correctly applied, you should start to consider the full cost, including the EPR fee of each material choice. This means that greener choices should also become commercially more sound, and producers should stop using materials that are hard to recycle and therefore carry a higher recycling fee. This is the essence of eco-modulation. Products that are cheap but potentially hard to recycle actually should become more expensive at the point of consumption. And so I want to come back to the slide I showed you earlier. EPR is about closing the potential gap in the value chain. There is value in waste and there can be profits in recycling, but it's critical to understand that we aren't prepared to let recycling stop when the economics don't work, or plateau and stagnate when they reach some kind of economic equilibrium. We have to intervene economically. Governments and civil society want us to push the recycling reaction in the direction of higher and higher collection. And this is going to require intervention. So I've brought you back to this slide because the reality is that EPR is not the only solution, and neither should it be seen to be. Governments, municipalities, and consumers all have their part to play in creating systems that will help us achieve our goals. But EPR is a critical part of the solution, and as industry, if we don't embrace the concept and collaborate with governments and municipalities to solve the very real waste management challenges we face as modern societies, then we'll be left with only three alternatives: taxes, rates, and container deposit systems. Thank you for listening. I know it's a lot to digest in 20 minutes, but I look forward to your questions during the panel discussion. Now over to you, Janine.
Thank you very much, David, and to you, Cherie, for your very interesting and descriptive presentations. I know that a lot of effort went into putting those together, and from Petco, we thank you. So now we will be going into our panel discussion. We'll also have a poll at the end of the formal proceedings, and Cherie will guide you through that when she closes off the proceedings. But for now, we're just going to keep things informal. We're going to keep it quite organic. We're going to actually combine our Q&A with our panel discussion to just move through things a little bit more quickly, but also more appropriately. So if you haven't submitted your questions yet, please do so through the Q&A panel. I haven't seen any pop up, but I will be keeping an eye on that and direct the questions as appropriate. So like I said, we're keeping it very informal and organic, and I'll get the ball rolling with a couple of questions to inspire the attendees. So first off, I'd like to ask both David and Cherie, what would a sustainable and effective EPR scheme actually look like in South Africa? We're obviously going to need to transition to a circular economy over the next few years. And so what is the roadmap that we will require to get there, and what are the implications?
David, would you like to start the ball rolling?
Well, thank you, Cherie. I'm not sure if that's thanks. Sure, good question, Janine. I think for me, the key to a sustainable and effective EPR scheme is that it's got to be both affordable and effective. And by that, I mean that in essence, what I've hoped to try and highlight is that there are obviously beautiful best practice systems across the world, and some of those would be beautiful, and I'm sure we'd love to have them. But my concern is that there's a limit to what we can actually afford, from a GDP per capita point of view, and therefore we have to look at something that is both affordable and efficient. And as I said, I think EPR is the key to that. But sort of to be a bit more specific, I think that an EPR scheme that works really is going to require buy-in from industry, contributing what we can and at levels that are sustainable, and then probably quite close collaboration with government and really municipalities. And I see that PROs are going to have to work with municipalities. I still think the municipalities should take the lead and be responsible for the primary movement of materials. But I would hope that PROs can step in, and EPR fees can be directed to increase the value of waste. And as I said, close the gap between what makes something a very costly and let's say uneconomic exercise, and something that starts to get the waste separated in a form that is usable. And then critically, on the other hand, I really think the role of PROs in this system is establishing the local recycling infrastructure and promoting the consumption of raw materials. Because as I hoped I impressed on people, if materials are consumed locally and people are willing to pay fair value for those materials, and in some cases a premium for those materials, it all goes towards reducing the ultimate cost of EPR and creating a system that works.
Janine, I'd like to add, I like the reference to a roadmap in your question, because I think that it's going to be a journey. We have a lot of distance to cover, and I think it's going to be really important that our schemes have a good, solid foundation to take us on that journey so that they can be both efficient and cost-effective for South Africa.
And just to add to that, there have been a couple of questions from the attendees. In terms of the role that government needs to play in terms of DEF to oversee and evaluate the EPR fees as they're being submitted by the PROs, are there any recommendations from your side in terms of the proposed EPR regulations from DEF?
I think that to me, the regulations are obviously going to change our world. I think there's no doubt. I think they're still in draft, but clearly the intent is clear. I think that government's role is to provide a framework and a direction in terms of where they want us to go. So I would hope that what we see in the final regulation is where we want to get to, which is largely going to be defined by our collection and recycling rates. And then I think, as Sherry alluded to earlier, all the EPR schemes that we can see globally are different. And we are going to see different solutions and different ways of achieving that locally. And I think that in that respect, the regulations can't be too prescriptive, because they may have something that applies very well to one material, but is completely inappropriate for another. So I really see the PROs being, let's say, the subject matter experts, and government telling us where we need to go through the regulations. And I hope that the other role that government can play is, as I said, is bringing the municipalities into this, because the reality is we can't actually achieve it without municipalities. And to some extent, as we know, in a number of schemes of sort of measures, municipalities need to be held more accountable, and their role in waste management is a critical, let's call it, foundation to us getting there. And I think that's where government can provide that sort of leadership and coordination.
Thank you, David. Sharija, would you like to add to that, or you feel it was adequately answered?
I think it's fair to say that if we have a clear view of what we need to do, we'll be able to work out how we need to do it. And because we are, as producer responsibility organizations doing this on behalf of obliged industry and civil society, there is an incentive to do it in the most cost-effective manner as possible.
Yeah, I think that is one of the key differences. So if you go back to my sort of different models, I really think that where EPR and for a lot of people on the call are from industry, and why I believe that EPR is so effective is that the people paying the fees and contributing must be directly involved with the PRO and must hold the PRO accountable, essentially, for spending their money. And that feedback loop is very tight on EPR systems. It's much looser in a system where we're contributing to a fiscus and there's a tax, and then the tax might come back in some kind of recycling incentive or something like that. And equally with your municipal rates. Municipal rates are better feedback. You generally have a better feedback between the rates you pay and the services you get as a consumer. But that in our context also has its weaknesses. And that's why I think EPR has this really tight link between money that industry pays and the results. And remember that as PROs, you're accountable to government, you're accountable to civil society, and you're accountable to industry that funds you. And that is a critical, let's call it a critical difference.
So we've spoken about the role that government needs to play, or not needs to play, but can play and should play within a functional system. We've spoken about the role of PROs. In your view, what is the role of civil society organizations in transitioning towards a circular economy and in supporting EPR?
Sherry, I'll let you go first on that one.
I think because EPR is a shared responsibility, I think that there are multiple roles. Everybody is involved, right from the raw material producer, the converter, the filler, the brand owner, the retailers and wholesalers, the consumers, packaging technologists, the collectors, and the recyclers. And we are all citizens of South Africa. Whilst we might work specifically in industry or not, we are all citizens and we all use paper and packaging, we all buy food. So I think that having accountability is really important. I think that the role of organizations on holding us accountable, on sharing the information, on actually understanding how it really works and what the complications are. I think if roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, it's a good approach to hold all of us accountable. We're all obliged, from the perspective of buying a product to doing something with it when we've finished using it. We're all obliged to be part of the system.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Sherry said, the one thing that I think that and to some extent, let's say the reason, without using French, for some of these civil society organizations is that there's a perception in some cases that let's say industry is industry, and even PROs to a lesser extent, are biased to either protecting their turf or protecting their products, or whether it's my role as Coke or Sherry's role as Petco. And to some extent, I think the civil society organizations effectively fill that niche where they're seen to represent the broader let's say non-compromised individuals or society. And that's where I think they have an important role to hold both industry and PROs and government responsible for establishing policy or implementing EPR and achieving the results that are required. And I think that, again, the key is that they measure on the outcomes as opposed to sort of maybe getting too involved in the how. It's that I think we all would like to be our outcomes measured.
Yes, they really can play a supportive role.
Yeah.
Speaking about measurement, one of the questions that has come up from the attendees is, what is the current thinking and the current planning around developing a harmonized reporting system in the context of EPR and for the PROs? What is your suggestion, or what would it be?
David, you've done so much research on this across all the material streams. Yeah. I'm going to let you have first stab at it, and I'll support you.
So I think that the first answer is that we are not alone in this. And as Sherry said, I've done quite a lot of research to try and understand it. And the reality is that all over the world, measurement has become a hot topic. And if you look up, if you try and research something like recycling rates, you know which country has the best recycling rates, you'll find a lot of notes about this is the claimed recycling rate, but we re-estimate it as X, or we believe this country's number, but we don't believe that country's number. So I think, for example, Wales, and I'm partly Welsh, about 10% in their methodology, and no longer seen as the sort of best in class. So we're not alone, and I think what it does is it highlights the importance of having a system and having standardization, because otherwise we get into the system where we have numbers, and then after 3 years we have to restate everything and start again. And I think that the key there, and this is one of the things that needs to come out of the Section 18, and perhaps it shouldn't be in Section 18, but it should be a standard that's then recognized either through some other kind of standards authority or put together by industry, is that we have a standard methodology for measurement. And what's critical in that measurement is where we measure and how we measure. So, for example, generally the place that people are moving to is what we would call a collected for recycling rate, which basically means you measure at the point of the recycler. So in other words, there are lots of different points along the recycling value chain, but you have to pick one where you can say, I will measure here, and I will measure in a way that's auditable and measurable. And the reality is that the recycler generally pays for the material, so the recycler then has an invoice and a weight, and that allows you to have an auditable chain of custody. Whereas if you measure at MRFs, or you measure at collectors, you measure at recycling, the risk is that you measure the same material more than once, because it can travel from collector to aggregator to buyback center to eventually to the recycler. So you want it to be at a recycler, and by a recycler I mean someone who's going to turn it into something else. And that seems to be the best place to measure. But there's definitely sort of a need for consistency, and it's probably something that as industry we need to pull together and say, this is how we're going to do it.
I think what I would like to add is that throughout Europe, they're moving to a consistent methodology. And what is interesting is that they're going to have a number of years to implement it, because of course it takes time to develop these systems. They don't happen overnight, but we really want to understand what the flow of material is. We need to have clear definitions so that when we use a unit of measurement, we clearly understand what it relates to. So I think that if we set ourselves an ambitious goal, we will work towards it. In the Petco example, it was quite interesting. We suddenly found, after a period of time, being able to look back, we had data, and initially we didn't really realize the value of that. So I think that's a really positive side, that we have had systems running in South Africa, and we've already got some insight in where the gaps are, what we need to measure, what is missing, and what we need to build into the system.
Mm. And just to build on what Sherry said, remember that the targets, and specifically the targets that are set by government, by civil society, by NGOs, by things like Plastics Pact, should be aligned to those measurements. So what we've seen in Europe is a restating of targets. So it's much better to define, as one of my sort of feedback on Section 18 is there should be no target without a methodology of measurement, because otherwise the risk is that you set a target and you agree the measurement methodology afterwards, and you suddenly realize that your target now is 5 or 10% off because of the way that you're measuring. And I think that's something that is really important. So it's not something that we can leave for very long if we want to get an agreement on targets.
Thank you. Another hot topic that's coming through on the attendee Q&A is the question around informal collectors and the informal sector and the role that PROs can play in supporting the integration of the informal sector. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that there are a couple of ways that we can help to integrate the informal sector. I think that one of the key elements is first of all in the way that we support our recyclers with funding, and we make a contribution through them towards the collection so that they're able to pay collectors per kilogram for what they buy. So that's one part of it, and that's really important because it makes sure that there's always a buyer for the material that collectors are working on getting. But in addition to that, there's plenty of opportunity to assist collectors with training, with identifying recyclables, with helping them to get better value for their recyclables, by helping them to establish small enterprises or businesses, by supporting with protective clothing and with infrastructure, with scales, with baling machines as they grow, with trolleys if that is what is needed, with conveyor belts. So there is also mentoring, because for many in the informal sector who start off recycling, they may start on a very basic level, and after 3 to 5 years they may well be running a small business, but they've had no formal training. And mentorship is really valuable because businesses go through cycles, as I'm sure you all know. So those are some of the ways that I think PROs in particular can assist the informal sector.
Thank you, Cherie. I wanted to ask specifically around the economics of recycling, because this is coming through on the Q&A as well. And there's a question surrounding how to explain and dissect the street value of recyclables and how it differs to what you would get at a waste picker level versus what you would get at a municipal drop-off versus private waste management companies versus whichever metropole or province that you find yourself in. David, I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on the concept of the economics of recycling.
Yeah, so I've also done quite a lot of work on this, and I was actually fortunate enough to enlist the help of some students from Georgetown University earlier in the year to also look at it. And most of you will know Dr. Melanie Sampson has done quite a lot of work in terms of understanding it, and we're hoping to do another sort of 6 months of investigation starting in the next few weeks, hopefully, to learn more. But I think, you know, if I come back to the principles that are highlighted earlier, is that different materials have different street values, and those are determined by exactly the graphs that I showed you. How much is it's the right hand side versus the left hand side. And the difficulty that we find is that some materials have a really high street value. So we know that aluminium, for example, sits and can be 8 to 10 Rand a kilo, sometimes more. PET and HDPE tend to be sort of more in the sort of 2 to 3 Rand category. And then you've got the likes of some of the paper fractions and glass, which is less than R1 a kilo. And what you will notice if you as a consumer look at particularly the informal collection, is that the informal collectors understand mostly the street value of the materials quite well, and they will pick and choose from your so-called recyclables that you put outside your door which materials actually have value. And so we have a couple of challenges. The first one is that some materials have no value. We think they're recyclables, but they currently have no value. And that, as part of this sort of grander scheme, is one of our greatest challenges, is what do we do with a material that currently has zero value? And it has zero value either because it cannot be recycled, or the cost of recycling and separating it is so high and the value of the material that's produced at the end is so low that the gap is just too big. Now, under EPR, effectively, that gap's got to get closed, and it'll get closed in two ways, either by putting a massive EPR fee on it or by getting rid of that material completely, because the material itself actually becomes uneconomical because of that cost. So the challenge that we're going to have as PROs and in terms of EPR is how are we going to enable recycling? And to Sherry's earlier point, the key to informal collection in particular, but also to formal collection, is that the material either at the informal collector or at the exit of the MRF. So MRF would be the materials recovery facility, something that the municipality might or where they would take their recyclables for collection, is that the materials coming out of that MRF will either have value or they won't have value. And we create value through the value chain by stimulating demand, by putting in EPR support. And at the end of the day, if the material is not worth enough, either at the MRF or to the informal collector, they will either not collect it or they will not separate it, in which case it'll go to landfill. And so the economics come back to, can you reuse it? Can you recycle it? Is there a recycling infrastructure locally? And is there a need, is there a consuming, something that's actually going to consume that material? And that's why things like recycled content and recycled content targets become such an important part of this EPR circuit. And you know, through Plastics Pact, they've got an ambitious target of 30% recycled content. And the idea behind that is to create demand, to create value, to enable recycling, and to lift the street value. But I think, as a last comment, for materials that have a low street value, they have to acknowledge that they have a real problem. It's either that the informal collector will not collect your material, or that formal collector will not collect it unless you pay them. And materials with a low street value are those that potentially are going to need the kind of EPR numbers that are going to make people scared. Because collection from home at the moment costs Joburg municipality between 3 and 4 rand per kilo. Okay, 3 to 4 rand per kilo. Now that is 3 to 4 times more than we are putting in as PETCO. And PETCO has the biggest support budget of all the PROs. So PROs that are saying, you know, we want to do waste collection at home, take your tonnage and multiply by 3 rand or 4 rand and see what that does to your budget. You're talking hundreds of millions of rands. And that's why we believe that bringing in informal waste collectors is so important, because we believe they can do it for probably less, but probably still the region of 1 to 2 rand a kilo.
I think I'd like to just add as well that on the other side of this coin, if you look at the countries where EPR has been running for 20, 30 years, they also have different cost structures. So for example, disposing of waste at landfill is very expensive. So there's a disincentive to just take everything to landfill. Our landfill is far, far, far too cheap. Our rates for disposal of waste are actually also very low. If you look at other countries with really high recycling rates and EPR systems, very often they have a pay-as-you-throw system, so that there's a disincentive. There's that, you know, I talked about a carrot and a stick approach on behavior change. So most of the really successful EPR schemes have that support. They have high landfill costs which are enforceable so that it doesn't just become an illegal dumping problem. In some instances where they recognize some materials have a really high value, they have a landfill ban for those materials. But of course, all of these things only work if they're enforced. So it's actually a balance of instruments that go into making EPR successful. It's not only the small portion that industry does in isolation.
Thank you very much, Cherie and David. In the interest of time, we're going to be drawing this to a close. My apologies for all the questions that were asked that we weren't able to get to. It's really good to see that there's so much interest in this topic. I'm going to be handing over to Cherie now. We're going to end off with a little bit of a poll just to understand and interrogate a little bit more in terms of what the attendees are learning through this and what they'd like to learn more about in future webinars. So Cherie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Janine, and thank you, David, for all your inputs and the incredible efforts in your slides to share the inputs with us today. So thank you all for spending the morning with us. I wish I could see you all. I really miss not being able to see you. We so appreciate your time, and we look forward to further discussions and developments in the EPR landscape in South Africa. The next few months are certainly going to be interesting, and I think we're all going to learn a huge amount. We hope to see you at our Circular Economy 2 webinar series next month. But before I say goodbye, I'd like to share a quote that I read in Business Maverick yesterday with you. It's a quote by Christine Lagarde, and she says, "The best way to predict your future is to create it." So I would like to leave that quote with you. And on that note, goodbye to all of you, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, stay warm, and until the next time, bye-bye.